Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and it's Tag Tuesday. Today's tag is the Bring Back Browsing tag, created by Karen at Roving Reader, and I was tagged by Pat at Book Chat with Pat. Prompt number 1, Magic of Discovery. Share a book you found while browsing that you may not have discovered otherwise. Now, I think there's going to be a bit of a theme with my answers, and what's going to link them is that most of them are going to be about books that I read over a quarter of a century ago. This first one must be at least 28, 30 years. And it's a time where I almost exclusively used the library service. I would be taken to the library in the town over rather than my own town library because it had a better selection. And by this point in my reading, I had just discovered the beats, and I think this guy I haven't read any. I don't think I've read any Beat Generation for a number of years, but at the time it really just did appeal to me, and I was looking for stuff in a similar vein, and I found Paul Bowles. He's not a beat writer, he's from a generation before, but I think he shares some of the philosophy, but his approach to the actual writing was much more of its time. So I'll say possibly less innovative. But the book I've chosen is The Sheltering Sky. Now, the problem with picking books from so long ago is there's a difference between a fond memory of discovering a book and recalling the specifics of it. But from memory, the plot as it stands it's fairly basic. There is a group of 3 travellers, husband and wife and a friend of the husband. They're Americans, but they are in Tangiers. The couple have been married for about 10 years and are self-destructive in their separate ways. They're not tourists, they are travellers. The husband throws himself into the local culture, puts himself about a bit, flashes his cash, but he falls ill with typhoid. So this is where it becomes difficult. I'm now recalling elements of the plot at the same time I'm trying to censor them as to not give anything away to people who might want to read the book. The wife goes wandering in the desert, but at this point she's by herself. The husband's friend has tried to make some advances on her which she has rebuffed. The magic of discovery here is this is a pre-internet age. I've gone to a library even in provincial England and have found something which I hadn't heard talked about. I think I knew the name. I think possibly where I picked it up is from reading something from one of the Beat authors that I was reading, which may have mentioned him. So this is probably what prompted me to pick the book up. But there is also discovery within the book. The characters going to this foreign country, finding out things about that country, finding out things about themselves in the process, not all of which, or not many of which, have pleasant consequences. In a way, it's a classic book to discover whilst browsing, because I don't think it's something that I would have gone out to look for specifically. I don't think that had I found it in a bookshop at that time, I would necessarily have parted with money to do so. So, another score for the libraries. And it's something that led me to find out and then seek out and order in to the library service some of his other works, which I think 1,000 Days of Mokhtar, Pages from Cold Point. I'm misremembering some of these titles. There's another 1,000 pages, so maybe it wasn't 1,000 Nights of Mokhtar. 100 Camels in the Courtyard. I'll list the books down below once I figured out what they were actually called. It's been a long time. I think they're probably worth a revisit. I probably would have found Paul Bowles eventually. Had I not been browsing, I don't think I would have found him at the time I did, when I was probably a bit more impressionable. And speaking of which, expanding world, prompt number 2, share a book that has made you view things from another perspective or exposed you to new ideas. I'm going to go with Under Milk Wood by Dylan Thomas. The shelves I'm browsing this time are the ones at home. There was not a wealth of literature. There was a stack of history books. But in terms of fiction, things were fairly thin on the ground unless I wanted to read Poldark, which I didn't. But there was a copy of Under Milk Wood by Dylan Thomas. I was already a reader. And this is, how old am I at this point? 13, 14. I'd finished with kids' books. I'm probably reading a lot of sort of not very good non-fiction. And maybe starting to read James Herbert, Stephen King. I don't really think I was reading science fiction much even by this point. Maybe I'm reading a little bit of Nicholas Fisk or someone like that. But I haven't yet come across fantasy. I haven't yet come across sort of literary fiction. But this is where Under Milk Wood comes in. So I'm certainly not reading poetry. And whilst Under Milk Wood is more I think it's called a play for voices, it is utterly poetical. And it is the book which, for better or worse, got me into reading literature. And in terms of perspective, as the prompt says, sort of looking at things from a new perspective, I think Under Milk Wood is a good one. The books that I've read up until this point have narratively been from one perspective. With Under Milk Wood, it's a play which can be read very easily, not like many no stage directions, but there are many voices, and being put into so many different viewpoints of the same event, and the event really is just a town waking up for the day and doing it so beautifully. I think absolutely just hooked me at the time. Prompt number 3, open to change. Share a book that has changed who you are as a person or altered your day-to-day habits. Prompt number 3, open to change. Share a book that has changed who you are as a person or altered your day-to-day habits. The book I've chosen for this is George Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London. It's a very specific way it changed one habit, but I think it's a good one to have changed. I'm not entirely sure it still rings true in this day and age, but why take a chance? And there's a lot of lessons from Down and Out in Paris and London. It certainly shows you a new perspective. It certainly shows empathy on Orwell's part with the down and outs, but the one thing I took away from it at the time, and seems to have just stuck, is if you're walking down the street, someone gives you a flyer, you take the flyer, for the simple practical reason that once that person's run out of flyers, their job is done and they can go home. So flyers, pamphlets, free samples, just take it, as long as it's something you're not ideologically opposed to or actively allergic to. Help someone meet their quota. Maybe their day ends a little earlier. Maybe it stops them sort of standing outside on a cold street or a windy, rainy corner. Doesn't cost you anything and may help somebody out. Prompt number 4. Browse a bookstore, library or friend's shelves and talk about the book that you found there. Well, I was only on my commute, so my book shop choices are somewhat limited. But I did go to Hatchard's in London St Pancras train station, and I did try to film stuff, so if that worked, here's the footage now. And I did eventually get a book. Although Hatchards do a good job in hiding it, they are owned by Waterstones. Waterstones, for those who don't know, is the only remaining bookshop chain in the United Kingdom, and they will from time to time buy, either as investments or either as saving, prestigious independent bookshops, of which Hatchards was one. Hatchards has been a bookseller since 1797, although the shop in St Pancras is much more modern than that. Inside the shop, it is unfortunately much like a normal Waterstones. There are a couple of concessions to this. There is a small selection of older first editions and more rare books at the back of the shop, but I've never found something there that's really piqued my interest. And for the most part, it's just your average bookshop selling the latest titles. I might take offence that the fantasy and science fiction section is right next to the children's section and mixed up with the manga. I might take a bit more offence that the poetry section is barely a shelf long, but at the same time, this is just a bookshop in a train station. So, as bookshops in train stations go, it's pretty good. But there's not a lot that interests me. Obviously, there are books that I would read, but they are not books that I would pay £10 for a new copy for. I was, however, successful. There was a book which I'd seen whilst browsing 3 or 4 weeks ago and nearly got at the time. What I do sometimes when we're talking new books and I know that I can readily get a copy is I will let that idea sit for a while and decide whether I really do want to part with cash to get it. And I did. And I think maybe what sealed it is that it's a signed copy, and it is a signed copy of Alice Luxton, Uproar: Satire, Scandal and Printmakers in Georgian London. London, 1772. A young artist called Thomas Rowdenson is making his way through the grimy back streets of the capital on his way to begin studies at the Royal Academy schools. Within a few years, James Gilray and Isaac Cruikshank will join him in Piccadilly, turning satire into an art form, taking on the British establishment and forever changing the way we view power. Set against a backdrop of royal madness, political intrigue and the birth of modern celebrity, French Revolution, American independence and the Napoleonic Wars, Uproar follows the satirists as they lampoon those in power, from the Prince Regent to Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire. Their prints and illustrations deconstruct the political and social landscape with surreal and razor-sharp wit, as three men vie with each other to create the most iconic images of the day. And it's a subject that I don't know nearly enough about. I know the very famous pictures, and I know the impact that they've had. The caricature way of portraying the political class is something that has remained in British newspapers to the present day. But I'd be interested to find out more about the origin. I like browsing in bookshops. More specifically, I like browsing in second-hand bookshops. My problem is that I have very little in the way of discernment. I have no filter. If I see something and it piques my interest even slightly, I usually think it's worth £1.50, £2 to scratch that itch. And as impulse buys, I may not be feeling that impulse by the time I get the books back home. But this is what I like about BookTube. It reminds me of these things that I do have on my shelves and that I should be reading. For the parts that BookTube doesn't even reach, I have the tote bag of Mild Peril, where I will choose the next book I'll be reading at random, or one of the next books I'll be reading at random. I've just in the last week read The Bride of Fu Manchu, which was my current pick. So when I come to my weekly roundup of Garb August reads tomorrow, I shall be picking a new one. When I say tomorrow, I'm speaking to you on Tuesday. I actually mean 2 days ago on the videos. I hope that makes sense. But until then, or back then, or now, bye.